What's up guys, today I'd love to share with you one of the most unknown and underrated openings, the central game. And I remember back in the day when I was an international master, I got a new coach and he told me I'll show you this new cool opening. And it was the central game. And initially I was like, really? It's just about opening, like knight c6 and black gains a tempo. But he offered me to play a couple of blitz games and I quickly realized that it's definitely much trickier than I thought. And honestly, to be completely fair, although I wasn't international master already at the time, I knew nothing about the theory of this opening. So lots of your opponents will be unprepared. Now, what's the point of the central game and how you're going to attack from here? Well, the one thing is that you take away this square from your opponent's bishop, so they can't play bishop c5, which is something that they usually play. Although, according to the database, there are still 72,000 people who play this blunder bishop c5, blundering a bishop in one move. Another idea, if your opponent plays their bishop anywhere else, in the future, not right now, but in the future, you can always relocate your queen to g3 and hit this pawn, which is kind of uncomfortable. And even if your opponent has castled, still that allows you to create quite strong attack there. Another thing is your queen actually supports this pawn on e4 and kind of stands in an ambush. If your opponent ever pushes the pawn forward d5, trying to open up this bishop, that would be a big blunder, because e takes d5 counts with a discover check, so your opponent has no time to recapture, and we also hit this knight. So that's clearly bad for black. Finally, if your opponent ever wants to bring the knight forward to f6, they always have to worry about you pushing the pawn forward and attacking the knight. And because they don't know the theory of this line, they'll usually feel uncomfortable about it, and since you'll be prepared, you will know how to handle it. Let me show you one of the classical and really fun variations. Sometimes, because your opponent can't develop the bishop right here and playing bishop e7 feels passive, they'll play bishop b4 check, hoping for you to just cover with the knight, but you can instead play c3, kicking the bishop away, and after that I can go bishop c4, putting the bishop to an active square. Now, they still might feel uncomfortable to go knight f6 because they always have to worry about this pawn driving the knight away. So they go knight e7, which feels safer for black. Now, after that, you play queen to g3, hitting this pawn on g7. Your opponent castles to defend the pawn, but then you push the h-pawn forward, trying to create some sort of attack. Also, bishop h6 might be coming, taking advantage of this spin, and somehow the situation starts feeling uncomfortable for black. They often go knight g6 because it feels good to cover this file, so that you can't go bishop h6, but all of a sudden after h5 and knight e5, your opponent feels like the position is good, they're attacking this bishop, but they're already gone. And there were lots of players, including very strong players, who fell into this trap. So you instead go bishop g5, counter-attacking the queen. Now they can't move this pawn forward because it's pinned down by this bishop. Therefore, they gotta move the queen. But then you still don't defend this bishop, you instead counter with bishop f6, and this time it's pretty serious. Queen takes g7 is a checkmating one. They have no choice but to push the pawn forward, and then you trade it off. Now, they can't move this pawn, it's still pinned. If they take by this pawn, that will lead to this rook h8 checkmate. Therefore, the move they play here after this trade is knight takes g6, but then you sacrifice the queen. Queen takes g6, and it leads to this beautiful checkmate. Another funny variation occurs right in the main line of the central game, when they play knight f6. Now, in this position, objectively speaking, you gotta play knight c3 followed by bishop d2 and long casting, which leads to just a standard position, normal game of chess. However, if it's a blitz game, I'd recommend that you instead take the most aggressive approach and play the move pawn e5, which is objectively not a good move, but in reality works really well. Now, you hit this knight and it's gotta go. Usually they'll go knight g4, choosing the most aggressive option. Knight e5 is not a problem, because you play queen e4, and this knight still has to go, you have space advantage and great position. Therefore, that's not an issue. But knight g4 is certainly something that you gotta know, because they hit your queen, they hit this pawn, you gotta be careful. You play queen e2, and this time we attack this knight on g4. In most cases, your opponents are going to take on e5, which is wrong and leads them to a bad position. Now, Stockfish will tell you that d6 gives black a great position. But first off, it's a very unnatural move to play because, instead of just taking a pawn for nothing, they actually give up the pawn, allow this discover check, and again, very counterintuitive move to play. Not many of your opponents, if anyone, will ever play this. And even after that, the position remains to be tricky. You can play knight f3 g5, hit this bishop, hit this knight. I mean, it's still not easy. But I wouldn't worry about it too much, because most of your opponents will actually here choose the most natural move and take on e5. And here the line is really funny. You take advantage of this pin, and you play f4, and you win this knight. Now, your opponents usually will try to be creative, will try to get out of this thing, and they'll play another run move. Instead of just losing one knight, they'll play knight e4, hoping to counterattack. But that doesn't do anything, and although it's the most played move by black, funnily enough. So you play queen takes c5, and now that's again the double attack. And as they try to cover, this time you play f5, and your opponent just hit the jackpot. They've blundered 2 knights in a row, according to the same tactics, right? This pin on the d file. So, unbelievable. I mean, they can do something, but it doesn't do anything. If they attack your queen, you just drop it back. If they ever play this check again, it doesn't change anything. Finally, checks are over, and on the next move you will win the second knight, getting a completely winning game. Another good looking move for black is to play pawn b6, because they're getting ready to play bishop c5 to develop their bishop to a usual square, plus to seemingly win a tempo hitting your queen. It's wrong in reality, but they think so. So we play knight c3, and after bishop c5, you're not worried about losing a tempo because you have to move the queen away, because you will actually shift it to a very active square. From here, we attack this pawn on g7, and we to some extent take aim at this pawn on c7, and black is already in big trouble. If they ever just g6, there are a bunch of weaknesses. You can bring the knight forward, you can bring the bishop forward, and it's gonna be bad for them. In most cases, they play queen f6, which is losing right away. After knight to d5, you hit the queen, they still gotta guard this pawn, and the main threat is knight takes c7, forking the king and rook. If they ever play queen to d6 or queen to e5, that doesn't change anything. You still can take this pawn on c7, check to the king. Queen x-rays the knight, so it can be captured, and on the next move you're going to take the queen and then win this rook in the corner, and you get a winning material advantage. So far we've covered the main lines, and now let's talk about a couple of what-ifs so that you're fully ready. But prior to that, a quick announcement that we're hiring a social media specialist, and you can get to know the details in the description below the video, and you've got a chance to work together with me and my team in the Remote Chess Academy, and we'll be happy to have you on board. Alright, what if they don't take on d4? Well, then they have to address this threat of you capturing their pawn in the center. Therefore, they'll need to defend it either with the knight or with a pawn. So if they go knight at c6, then you can push the pawn forward and take advantage of this exposed knight. If the knight keeps jumping forward, then after c3, it's gonna be lost, right? Notice that our bishop takes away this square. That's completely bad. Let's take it back. If they're more prudent, they're gonna move the knight back to e7. Now you play knight f3, attacking this pawn, and after knight g6, the very good move for you to play here is h4. You just try to keep chasing this knight, harassing it as hard as you can, and it's quite uncomfortable, because if you actually play h5, again, there is not much that this knight can do, and if they play h5 themselves, then it exposes this square, so you can land your bishop there, and it's also somewhat uncomfortable, they have to somehow cover it, and overall you have a nice active position. If your opponent wants to avoid complications and play d6, then I recommend that you keep putting more pressure and you play knight f3, adding one more attack to this pawn. Now if they trade here, you can still recapture with the queen, kind of similar to the main lines, but here it's much better for you, because after knight to c6, you don't even have to waste time and retreat your queen. Instead, you can play bishop b5 and take advantage of this pin. If they eliminate the pin, then you need to eliminate the knight, otherwise you'll lose the queen. And after that, I recommend that you play one more aggressive move, bishop g5. Quite often it confuses your opponent. You attack the queen, and it's not that clear how to get out of this without having some uncomfortable defensive position. If they go f6, then yeah, you just drop the bishop back, but their position overall is kind of weird. Their king is exposed, their bishop is a tall pawn, they can't get it out, the knight cannot be developed normally, so it's all ugly and you have a really great game here. If instead they play bishop e7, which is a very common move for them to play, then certainly we don't want to just trade bishops. Instead, they just blunder bishop queen takes g7, and it hits the rook. Then they try to take here, but you just take the rook, and now you attack here, 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 everywhere, and you have a winning material advantage. If you enjoyed this opening, you may find 5 most important critical traps of the center game, and check it out right here. That video got over 1 million views, so people apparently liked it, and you may find it useful as well. Or if you want to level up your chess overall, check out this free masterclass where I share my secrets about how to improve your chess rapidly.